Marcus Reed had always carved his own path. A self-taught carpenter and freelance designer, he'd spent years transforming a modest fixer-upper into his personal sanctuary, a cozy, ivy-draped cottage nestled at the edge of a well-manicured subdivision. Unlike many of his neighbors, Marcus had deliberately chosen to live off the official grid of a local homeowners association. His property, bordered by wildflower meadows and a centuries-old oak, was a canvas for his creativity. Handmade furniture, artful reclaimed wood accents, and a garden where nature and nurture coexisted in perfect, organic chaos. This intimate haven was not only his livelihood, but his refuge from the corporate grind. Every nail hammered, every brushstroke on a reclaimed beam, and every late-night design session held profound meaning. Yet, even as Marcus reveled in the freedom of his independent lifestyle, trouble was already brewing just across the manicured lawns and pristine sidewalks of the neighboring HOA community. Enter Kerren, a name that had become shorthand for overreach and entitlement in these parts. Known to residents as the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA's rigid rules, Kerren was as infamous for her iron-fisted management style as she was for her impeccably coordinated wardrobe. Despite Marcus not being an HOA member, Kerren's influence stretched far beyond the neatly drawn property lines of the community. It was as if she believed that her version of order and perfection was a public good, one that extended even to those who dared to live independently. One bright Saturday morning, as Marcus was arranging fresh bouquets on his porch, he heard the telltale sound of a sharp, authoritative voice. Stepping outside, he was met with the sight of Kerren striding up the gravel drive. Clutched in her manicured hand was a thick envelope, its official seal glinting in the sunlight. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," she began, her tone clipped and businesslike. "I'm here on behalf of the community to inform you that you are in violation of certain aesthetic guidelines." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Violations? But I'm not even in the HOA," he replied, his voice calm yet edged with disbelief. Kerren's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment her confident facade wavered. "That may be, but your property's appearance, your unsanctioned decor and nonconformist designs, is affecting the overall look of the neighborhood. We simply can't allow such deviations." Her words, as rehearsed as they were, struck a nerve. Marcus had chosen independence precisely to avoid the petty dictations of an organization that prided itself on enforcing conformity. "I appreciate your concern," he said slowly, "but I follow local laws and zoning regulations. I'm not bound by your HOA's arbitrary standards." The air was tense. Neighbors peering from behind trimmed hedges and manicured gardens began to take notice. Kerren's expression hardened into one of thinly veiled indignation. "Rules are rules," she snapped. "Even if you aren't a member, the community's well-being is at stake. I suggest you reconsider your choices before further action becomes necessary." With that, she handed him the envelope and turned on her heel, leaving Marcus with a mix of amusement and growing resolve. Back on his porch, Marcus opened the envelope to find a formal notice detailing a laundry list of alleged violations, from the unconventional angles of his custom-built window frames to the unapproved color of his front door's trim. Every item smacked of an agenda to stifle individuality, and though legally irrelevant for his non-HOA lot, it was a challenge to his very right to live freely. That afternoon, as Marcus sat in his cluttered workshop surrounded by sawdust and sketches of future projects, he couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. The notice was clearly meant to intimidate. Kerren was not simply doing her job. She was on a crusade against anyone who dared defy the unyielding norms of her jurisdiction. Marcus recalled his early days of learning carpentry, where the freedom to innovate was celebrated rather than condemned. Now, here was an agent of uniformity determined to impose a set of standards that didn't belong in his world. The confrontation that day wasn't explosive, no raised voices or physical altercation, but it set the stage for an unfolding drama. Marcus's independent spirit was being targeted by a system that thrived on control and rigid aesthetics. Even as he meticulously measured and planned for his next custom project, a nagging thought persisted. Kerren's intrusion wasn't just about a quirky color or unusual decor. It was a blatant power play. And so, with the envelope resting on his workbench, Marcus resolved to defend his independence. He began gathering local ordinances and zoning codes, determined to arm himself with the knowledge that would prove his legal right to live as he wished. His research wasn't driven by anger alone. It was a quest for justice, not just for himself, but for every free spirit who had ever been bullied by the tyranny of bureaucratic conformity. As dusk settled over the horizon, the idyllic quiet of Marcus's property took on a more determined, almost revolutionary air. In that moment, his home was not merely a place of refuge. It was a symbol of resistance against overreach, a beacon for those who believed that creativity should never be confined by the arbitrary dictates of a so-called community guardian. And though Kerren might believe her rules applied to everyone, Marcus was about to prove that sometimes the boldest act of defiance is simply to live your truth on your own terms. The following morning, Marcus awoke to an unexpected flurry of activity. His mailbox, usually a quiet repository for bills and the odd postcard, now bulged with a stack of official-looking letters. Among them was another notice from Kerren, this one outlining an even more elaborate list of infringements related to his property's features. The language was formal and intimidating, laden with legal jargon that threatened steep fines and potential legal action. Although Marcus wasn't under the jurisdiction of the HOA, Kerren's overreach was evident in every paragraph. Standing in his front yard, Marcus scanned the notice. It accused him of disturbing the community's uniform appearance and warned that continued defiance would prompt further measures, including calls to local inspectors and potential civil suits. He shook his head. "I'm not a member, and these fines are moot," he muttered. Yet the fact that Kerren was willing to waste her time and resources on him was a clear signal of her desire for total control. Across the street, meticulously maintained lawns and identically painted houses bore silent witness to the HOA's relentless drive for conformity. It was as if Kerren's personal vendetta had found a new target, one that wasn't even obligated to follow her rules. In a stroke of bureaucratic arrogance, she expected him to capitulate without question. Later that day, while Marcus reviewed his local zoning codes in his cluttered study, a sharp knock echoed at his door. It was a pair of uniformed inspectors sent by the HOA's compliance team. Their arrival was unannounced and, to Marcus's eyes, entirely unwarranted. "Good afternoon, sir," one of them said in a rehearsed tone, clipboard in hand. "We're here to inspect your property for any deviations from the accepted community standards." Marcus's smile was dry. "I'm sorry, but I'm not part of your association," he replied, gesturing vaguely to the sprawling countryside beyond his neat little garden. The inspectors exchanged puzzled looks, clearly unprepared for a response outside their scripted mandate. Their hesitation only further emboldened Marcus. "I'm following all applicable city codes and regulations. I suggest you verify your jurisdiction before proceeding." Back at his workbench, Marcus felt the sting of the morning's absurdity. Kerren's tactics were no longer confined to snide remarks and mailed notices. They had evolved into official inspections and unfounded accusations. He began drafting a formal letter of complaint, citing local laws and his non-membership status. With careful precision, he noted every instance of overreach and compiled evidence that demonstrated his property's complete compliance with municipal regulations. That evening, as Marcus sat with his laptop under the gentle glow of a desk lamp, he posted an update on his personal blog, a platform he'd built over years to share his woodworking projects and musings on independent living. His post detailed the day's events, highlighting the surreal experience of being hounded by a community entity that had no right to govern him. "It seems," he wrote wryly, "that some people believe the rules of their little club extend to everyone. But I'm not in the HOA, and I have every right to live and design my life as I see fit." The post quickly garnered attention. Neighbors from both inside and outside the HOA began to comment. Some sympathized with his plight, recalling their own experiences of being cornered by Kerren's domineering personality, while others expressed amusement at the absurdity of the situation. Still, others were concerned that Kerren's actions might foreshadow an even larger campaign of arbitrary rule enforcement. As twilight deepened, the specter of Kerren's authority loomed larger than ever. Her power move had not only unsettled Marcus, but had also raised questions among onlookers. Why was an HOA enforcer so bent on imposing uniformity on someone who had never signed up for the club? And what did it say about the community's willingness to tolerate overreach? For Marcus, the answer was simple. Kerren's tactics were rooted in a desire for control, a control that was increasingly out of place in an era when individuality was celebrated rather than suppressed. His response to the inspections and fines was not one of fear or submission, but of calculated resistance. Every document he compiled, every law he cited, was a tool in his arsenal against an irrational system. That night, as he secured his evidence in a neatly organized folder, Marcus couldn't help but feel a surge of defiance. Kerren's first power move had only served to strengthen his resolve. He was determined to expose the hypocrisy and overreach of an organization that believed its rules were universal, even for those who had chosen a different path. And with that determination burning bright, Marcus Reed prepared himself for the escalating battle that lay ahead. Over the next several days, the situation took an increasingly sinister turn. Kerren, frustrated by Marcus's noncompliance and emboldened by her own self-importance, began to escalate her tactics. What had once been a series of formal notices and unexpected inspections evolved into a campaign of intimidation marked by false violations and baseless threats. Late one afternoon, while Marcus was busy in his workshop refinishing a reclaimed oak table, he received an urgent call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was clipped and cold. "Mr. Reed, you are hereby notified that failure to permit a routine inspection of your property within 48 hours will result in immediate legal action. This is your final warning." The tone was menacing, and it was clear that Kerren's reach was growing bolder by the minute. Marcus's pulse quickened. He knew his property was in full compliance with all local ordinances, yet Kerren was manufacturing violations based solely on her own subjective criteria. Determined to document every absurdity, Marcus began recording each encounter. He set up a small camera on his porch to capture any further attempts by Kerren or her accomplices to breach his privacy. At the next community meeting, an event traditionally reserved for discussing neighborhood improvements, Kerren took the floor with a haughty air. "We are committed to preserving the beauty and harmony of our community," she declared, her eyes darting toward the small group of independent homeowners present. "Even those who do not abide by our voluntary standards must respect the established guidelines for the benefit of all." Her gaze landed on Marcus, who sat calmly in the back. The room buzzed with tension. A few board members exchanged uneasy glances. Whispers of dissent and confusion rippled through the crowd. It wasn't long before one sympathetic board member, whose own property had faced similar scrutiny in the past, leaned over and murmured to Marcus that not everyone agreed with Kerren's heavy-handed methods. That small gesture of solidarity lit a spark in Marcus's heart. Emboldened, he decided to take matters into his own hands. Over the following days, Marcus delved deep into the HOA's records. He discovered that many of the fines and violations were not supported by any municipal code, but were instead based on Kerren's personal interpretations, and, in some cases, were entirely fabricated. Rumors began circulating among residents that Kerren was funneling money from these arbitrary fines into a personal fund for community enhancements, a claim that painted her as both corrupt and delusional. Determined to gather concrete evidence, Marcus began a discreet investigation. He attended several board meetings under the guise of a concerned neighbor, quietly recording conversations and taking notes on every mention of fines, inspections, and unexplained expenditures. Each revelation confirmed what he already suspected. Kerren's agenda was less about community improvement and more about her own self-aggrandizement. One evening, while reviewing his notes in the dim glow of his workshop, Marcus received a tip from an anonymous source, a longtime resident who had grown tired of the constant harassment. The informant revealed that Kerren had recently orchestrated a surprise inspection at another property not even within the HOA's jurisdiction. The timing, the exorbitant fines, and the complete lack of any legal basis all pointed to a pattern of abuse. Marcus knew he had to expose this, not only to clear his own name, but to liberate the community from a reign of tyranny. Armed with evidence and a growing network of like-minded neighbors, Marcus prepared for a counteroffensive. His plan was twofold: compile all the documentation of Kerren's overreach and present it in a public forum where the community could see the truth. In late-night sessions, fueled by strong coffee and determination, he organized photographs of falsified documents, audio recordings of board meetings, and copies of local ordinances that clearly showed his rights as an independent homeowner. With every piece of evidence, Marcus's resolve hardened. He realized that Kerren's escalating tactics were not merely bureaucratic missteps. They were deliberate attempts to intimidate and control. And while she might believe that her authority was absolute, the truth was that her power was built on lies. Marcus was determined to dismantle that facade once and for all. As the days turned into a tense stalemate, the community's sentiment began to shift. Neighbors, once cowed by the fear of fines and legal threats, started to speak up. They recounted stories of unreasonable inspections and whispered about the mysterious diversion of funds. In hushed but resolute tones, they confided in Marcus, offering further proof of Kerren's malfeasance. It became clear that the fight was no longer just about one property. It was about restoring fairness and transparency to an entire neighborhood. In the midst of this turmoil, Marcus felt an invigorating mix of anger and hope. He was not merely defending his right to live freely. He was championing the cause of every independent homeowner who had been pushed aside by an overbearing system. And as he prepared for what promised to be the next phase of this battle, Marcus knew that the war against arbitrary power was just beginning. One overcast morning, as a light drizzle misted over the landscape, Marcus awoke to a scene straight out of a bureaucratic nightmare. Parked right in front of his front door was a bulky delivery van emblazoned with the HOA's insignia, a van he had never seen before, rumbling ominously as it blocked his only access. Attached to the windshield was a hastily scrawled note: mandatory access for routine inspection. Non-compliance will be prosecuted. Marcus's stomach churned. The van was an unmistakable physical manifestation of Kerren's overreach. Though his property lay outside the HOA's jurisdiction, Kerren had somehow convinced her cronies that she possessed the right to force her way in. Determined not to be bullied, Marcus marched to the front door and, with deliberate calm, answered knock. Standing on the threshold was Kerren herself, red-faced and fuming, her eyes darting between the van and Marcus's steady gaze. "Marcus, I demand you open your gate immediately," she barked. "We have inspectors waiting, and this is a matter of community safety." Marcus crossed his arms, his tone measured. "I'm sorry, Kerren, but I don't recognize your authority over my property. I'm not a member of your HOA, and I have every legal right to refuse entry." For a moment, the air was charged with tension. Kerren's eyes widened as if she'd been caught in a moment of weakness, then hardened into indignation. "You leave me no choice," she declared, and with a furious gesture, she reached for her phone as if to call for backup. But before she could complete her demand, a neighbor, Mr. Delgado, who had long suffered under Kerren's arbitrary inspections, stepped forward from behind a row of hedges. "That's enough, Kerren," he shouted, drawing the attention of a growing crowd of onlookers. "You have no right to barge onto private property that isn't even part of your association." Emboldened by the neighbor's support, Marcus calmly explained, "I invite you all to review the local zoning laws. They clearly state that your enforcement only applies to properties that have opted into the HOA. My property is independent, and I choose to manage it as I see fit." The assembled crowd murmured in agreement. A few residents began recording the confrontation on their phones. Kerren, her face flushing with humiliation and anger, tried to regain control. "This is not about personal preference. It's about maintaining community standards," she insisted. But the more she spoke, the more her words rang hollow against the clear evidence of her overreach. Marcus then reached into his pocket and produced a printed copy of the relevant local ordinance. Its bold text, an official seal, a silent rebuke to Kerren's unfounded claims. According to Section 4.2 of the Municipal Code, he said, his voice steady and resolute, properties that are not part of the HOA cannot be subjected to these standards. I'm not obligated to allow an inspection by a private entity, and your threats have no legal merit. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Kerren's eyes darted around, noting the shifting allegiances and the recording devices capturing every moment. In that instant, it was clear that her usual tactics of intimidation were failing miserably. As the van idled and a few of her so-called inspectors retreated, Kerren's resolve began to crack. Outside, a local news van, drawn by the commotion, pulled up, and a reporter began interviewing shocked residents about the incident. Marcus, meanwhile, took a deep breath. This was his moment to not only defend his rights, but to expose the corruption that had been festering within the HOA for far too long. That evening, during a hastily convened community forum at the local community center, Marcus presented the incident as the latest in a long line of overreaches by Kerren and her cohorts. He showed photos and video clips of the van, the unauthorized note, and even a snippet of the exchange with Kerren. The evidence was irrefutable, and it sparked a palpable sense of outrage among the residents. One by one, neighbors recounted their own experiences of being harassed or bullied by the HOA's enforcement tactics. The room filled with murmurs of agreement and indignation, a shared understanding that they had been under the thumb of an authoritarian figure who had no business dictating how they should live their lives. For Marcus, the van incident was more than a personal victory. It was a rallying cry for change. His refusal to allow Kerren access had not only reasserted his own rights, but it also laid bare the absurdity of an overreaching system. As the meeting adjourned, plans began to coalesce for a coordinated effort to challenge the HOA's authority in public forums and, if necessary, in court. Outside the community center, as residents dispersed with renewed determination, Marcus felt a mix of relief and anticipation. Kerren's extreme actions had inadvertently united the independent homeowners, and what had started as a personal confrontation was evolving into a full-blown grassroots movement against arbitrary power. And though Kerren would likely try to double down in the days to come, Marcus was confident that the truth and the will of the community would ultimately prevail. As the pressure mounted on Kerren from every corner of the community, her tactics grew increasingly desperate. One early morning, just as the sky was beginning to lighten, Marcus received a series of frantic phone calls from several neighbors. Rumors spread that Kerren had taken an unprecedented step. She had arranged for a team of emergency responders to forcibly enter properties under the guise of protecting community safety. The air was thick with tension, and Marcus braced himself for the worst. That very morning, as he sipped his coffee on his porch, Marcus noticed an unfamiliar black SUV parked near the entrance to his property. Moments later, two figures in dark uniforms, seemingly hired security, approached his gate. Their leader, a man with a stern expression and a badge that looked suspiciously unofficial, announced, "Mr. Reed, we have been sent to secure your property for an urgent inspection. Please grant us access immediately." Marcus's heart raced. He knew all too well that this was Kerren's final, desperate bid to assert her control over properties she had no right to govern. "I'm sorry," he replied coolly, "but I must refuse. I'm not part of the HOA, and your presence here is entirely unauthorized." The security team's leader frowned and reached for his radio, as if to call in backup. At that moment, Kerren herself appeared, her face a mask of fury and panic. "This isn't a joke, Marcus," she hissed, her voice cracking with desperation. "You leave me no choice. This is for the good of the community." Before Marcus could respond, one of the security guards stepped forward, attempting to force the gate open. Marcus, ever calm and collected, swiftly activated a hidden camera he had installed near the entrance. As the confrontation unfolded, he recorded every moment: Kerren's enraged outburst, the aggressive gestures of the guards, and the startled reactions of onlooking neighbors who had gathered at a safe distance. In a dramatic twist that would soon be the talk of the town, the security team's leader, confronted with Marcus's resolute refusal and the clear evidence of overreach, began to waver. "Sir, he stammered, glancing nervously at Kerren. whose eyes now darted between the escalating chaos and the recording devices capturing every second. Just then, the local police arrived on the scene, having been alerted by an anxious neighbor. Officers in crisp uniforms quickly assessed the situation. One of them approached Kerren, who was now waving her arms wildly and shouting about protecting the community, while another officer gently intervened with the security guard. "We need to check your authorization," the officer said firmly, scanning the scene and noting the presence of the unauthorized personnel. Within minutes, it became clear that Kerren's desperate measures were unsupported by any legal mandate. The police, after a brief exchange and inspection of the SUV's credentials or lack thereof, informed her that her actions were not only unlawful, but constituted trespassing. "I'm sorry, but you and your team are being detained for interfering with private property," the officer announced, much to Kerren's chagrin. In the ensuing commotion, Marcus calmly addressed the small gathering of residents who had assembled, their expressions a mix of shock and vindication. "This," he said, gesturing to the scene unfolding before them, "is exactly what happens when one abuses their power. Kerren's final desperate move has only shown how far she's willing to go to control a community that never invited her interference." Neighbors began recording the events on their smartphones, and within minutes, the footage was circulating on social media, capturing Kerren's outburst, the security team's reluctant compliance, and the unequivocal authority of the police. The public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Hashtags condemning her overreach trended locally, and the evidence of her misconduct left little doubt about her lack of jurisdiction. Later that day, during an emergency HOA board meeting convened in a sparsely attended room, Kerren attempted to justify her actions. "I did this to protect the standards of our community," she insisted, her voice wavering as the board members exchanged incredulous looks. But as Marcus's evidence, including the police report and multiple video recordings, was presented, her argument crumbled like a house of cards. The board, already rattled by the growing chorus of discontent, realized that Kerren had not only overstepped her bounds, but had put the entire HOA in legal jeopardy. With heavy reluctance, they announced that they would launch an internal inquiry into her conduct and immediately cease any further enforcement actions against non-members. Kerren's final desperate move had backfired in spectacular fashion, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. That night, as the community buzzed with a mix of relief and righteous anger, Marcus sat quietly on his porch. The adrenaline of the day's events had subsided, leaving behind a sober realization. Kerren's tactics, however extreme, could not override the truth. And in that truth, the seeds of her inevitable downfall were sown. In the wake of the dramatic events, and with Kerren's final desperate move now immortalized in public record, the community began to rally like never before. The very foundation of the HOA, built on arbitrary standards and unchecked authority, was crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. Within days, an emergency town meeting was called by a coalition of independent homeowners and concerned residents. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation as neighbors filled the community center, their faces determined and resolute. Marcus, whose quiet defiance had grown into a full-fledged movement, was invited to speak before the assembled crowd. With a calm yet impassioned tone, he recounted the string of abuses that had plagued the area, from unwarranted fines and illegal inspections to Kerren's outrageous attempt to force her way onto private property. The rules that govern a community should be made for its benefit, not used as weapons against those who choose a different way of living, Marcus declared, his voice resonating with conviction. "Today, we say enough is enough. We reject the tyranny of a system that values conformity over creativity and control over compassion." The response was overwhelming. Neighbors who had long suffered in silence, fearing retaliation or ostracism, now found their voices. One by one, residents stepped forward to share their own experiences of harassment and intimidation. A small business owner recounted how Kerren had demanded he repaint his storefront, even though his business was located outside the HOA boundaries. A retired couple tearfully recalled fines for having a non-conforming garden design that had brought beauty and diversity to their block. As the meeting progressed, the evidence Marcus had painstakingly gathered was presented in a multimedia display. Video clips of Kerren's outbursts, copies of the fabricated notices, and the police report from the unauthorized inspection. The irrefutable proof left little room for doubt. The assembled crowd erupted in applause and cheers when a motion was put forward to initiate a vote of no confidence in the current HOA leadership. Even several board members, previously complicit or silent, began to express their remorse and support for radical change. Within a week, the vote was held. In a landslide decision that sent shockwaves throughout the community, Kerren was officially removed from her position of power. The HOA board was restructured, and new elections were scheduled to bring in representatives who valued transparency, fairness, and respect for individual rights. Kerren's once untouchable aura was shattered. Her face, now synonymous with abuse of power, appeared on local news reports as a cautionary tale of hubris and overreach. The fallout wasn't limited to Kerren's dismissal. As legal investigations were launched into the HOA's practices, several board members were implicated in schemes involving the misappropriation of funds and the fabrication of fines. The community, united by their shared struggle, began filing class action lawsuits against the HOA. Local authorities, spurred by the mounting evidence and public pressure, levied hefty fines on the organization for operating outside the bounds of municipal law. For Marcus, the victory was bittersweet. He had never sought personal glory. His fight had always been for the broader principle of individual freedom and community self-determination. Yet, as he watched the crumbling edifice of the HOA's old regime, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of accomplishment. The oppressive structure that had once dictated every minute detail of his life was finally collapsing, replaced by a renewed spirit of democracy and shared responsibility. In the days that followed, as new board members took office and residents began drafting a new charter for community governance, the neighborhood slowly returned to a state of calm and optimism. Former victims of the HOA's tyranny began to rebuild their lives, now free from the constant fear of arbitrary fines or invasive inspections. For many, the removal of Kerren wasn't just a legal victory. It was a reclaiming of dignity and personal sovereignty. As Marcus sat on his porch one cool evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The battle had been long and hard fought, but it had united the community in a way that nothing else could. The once dominant figure of Kerren was now relegated to the annals of local infamy, a stark reminder of what can happen when power is abused. And so, as the old HOA crumbled and a new, more equitable system took root, the neighborhood emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to protect the freedoms they had reclaimed. In the weeks after Kerren's removal, the full extent of the HOA's malpractices came under intense legal scrutiny. Local authorities, armed with the extensive evidence Marcus had provided, began a thorough investigation into the HOA's operations. The inquiry revealed that not only had Kerren misappropriated funds for her personal benefit, but several board members had colluded in enforcing arbitrary fines and unwarranted inspections. As the investigation unfolded, the city imposed substantial fines on the HOA for violating municipal regulations. A class action lawsuit was promptly filed on behalf of the affected residents, with Marcus emerging as one of the lead voices in the legal battle. His careful documentation of every overreach, every fabricated notice, and every unauthorized inspection became the cornerstone of the case. The courtroom drama that ensued was as intense as it was revealing. Marcus testified before a panel of judges, laying out the systemic abuses that had plagued the community. His calm, factual recounting of events, supported by video evidence, copies of legal documents, and sworn statements from neighbors, left little doubt about the HOA's misconduct. One judge sternly remarked that the organization's actions were a gross abuse of power and an affront to the basic rights of homeowners. News outlets picked up the story, and within days, headlines blared about the downfall of the corrupt HOA. The public backlash was swift and decisive. As settlements were reached and punitive fines levied, The HOA's old leadership was forced to resign, and the organization itself underwent a radical restructuring to restore public trust. For Marcus, this legal victory wasn't about personal triumph. It was about sending a message. No matter how entrenched an authoritarian system might seem, the truth always prevails. His final power move was to ensure that every homeowner, whether part of the HOA or not, knew their rights and could stand up against unjust practices. With the legal consequences in full effect, the community began to heal, confident that justice had been served. As the legal hammer fell on the HOA, Kerren's personal life began to unravel in parallel. Once the unchallenged enforcer of arbitrary rules, she now found herself at the center of a public scandal. Local newspapers and online platforms painted a damning portrait of a woman who had abused her power to the detriment of the community. Within days of her ouster, Kerren was forced to resign in disgrace. Rumors spread that her personal finances were in shambles. Her lavish spending, once justified as community enhancement, was now revealed to be funded by misappropriated HOA dollars. Friends and acquaintances distanced themselves, leaving her isolated in a rapidly crumbling world. The turning point came when a longtime neighbor, emboldened by recent events, shared a video clip of Kerren's latest outburst, a moment when she attempted to justify her actions on live local television. Her words, full of indignation and desperation, only confirmed what everyone already knew. Kerren's authority was built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. The clip went viral, and soon, even those who had once feared her would mock her fall from grace. In a final twist of poetic justice, Kerren was offered a position by a small property management firm, one that prided itself on modern, progressive policies rather than outdated, authoritarian practices. When she arrived for her first day on the job, she was met with incredulous stares and thinly veiled laughter. "I guess you really do have to follow the rules," one colleague remarked with a wry smile. For Marcus and the community, Kerren's personal downfall was the ultimate vindication. She had sought to control every aspect of neighborhood life, but in the end, her hubris had become her undoing. Her lavish lifestyle, once a symbol of her misguided authority, was replaced by public humiliation and irrelevance. The once feared enforcer of HOA mandates was now nothing more than a cautionary tale, a living reminder that unchecked power always eventually falls. Months after the tumultuous showdown, the neighborhood had settled into a newfound peace, a peace earned through collective courage and the steadfast refusal to bow to tyranny. Marcus Reed, now regarded as a quiet hero by many, continued to live his life on his own terms in his beloved independent cottage. The scars of the past slowly healed, replaced by a vibrant sense of community spirit and mutual respect. On one crisp autumn evening, as golden leaves danced around quiet streets, Marcus relaxed on his porch. Neighbors strolled by, greeting one another with warm smiles and light-hearted banter. In a final twist of humor, a friend, always quick with a joke, handed him a mock HOA violation notice printed on bright, festive paper. For excessive freedom and creative design, it read in playful lettering. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "They really did try," he said, echoing the words that had become a rallying cry. In that moment, the entire ordeal transformed from a bitter memory into a shared joke, one that bonded the community even tighter. The legacy of the HOA's oppressive past had given way to a new chapter, one where every resident knew that their individuality and freedom were worth fighting for. And as the stars began to twinkle above the quiet neighborhood, Marcus leaned back in his chair, content in the knowledge that the battle had been won. In the soft glow of the porch light, with laughter echoing in the background and the distant hum of a community reborn, Marcus's story became a legend, a mic-drop moment that reminded everyone that even the most entitled tyrants could be overthrown by the simple, unyielding power of truth. Fade to black.